So Eric Trump just pled the fifth. What happens now? Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So we just learned that Eric Trump invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Let's talk about two things. One, has Eric now joined the ranks of his dad and his brother Don Jr. in pleading the fifth? And two, what is the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination? Who can invoke it? And what happens once somebody does? So if you'll indulge me for a minute, let's go to Team Justice Law School and talk about the Fifth Amendment. So in pertinent part, the Fifth Amendment provides that no person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. So we know that the Attorney General for the state of New York, Leticia Tish James, has been investigating the Trump organization for possible financial crimes, possible tax crimes, possible other crimes. And we just learned that she had subpoenaed Eric Trump to testify before the grand jury in her investigation of the Trump organization. Eric Trump's attorneys issued a statement, and it was kind of cute, kind of slippery, a little misleading, but here is the statement issued by Eric Trump's lawyers. So the reporting is that Eric Trump is refusing to be interviewed, with his lawyers saying, quote, "We cannot allow the requested interview to go forward pursuant to those rights afforded to every individual under the Constitution," closed quote. They didn't want to put Fifth Amendment in there, but take it from me, folks, that's the one they're invoking. I mean, they're certainly not invoking, the Third Amendment. Nobody's trying to quarter soldiers in Eric Trump's home. They just didn't want to say Fifth Amendment, but that's what they're talking about. So let's discuss who gets to invoke the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. In the lawyer's statement submitted by Eric Trump's lawyers, it says every individual has that constitutional right. Every individual has a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Can I suggest, after 30 years as a prosecutor and somebody who also has taught constitutional law and presently teaches criminal justice at George Washington University, that they're wrong about that? Why do I say they're wrong? Because only people who have committed a crime, or people who, if required to testify before the grand jury pursuant to a subpoena, would incriminate themselves, would give the government or the grand jury information about their own criminal conduct, only those people can invoke their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination and avoid testifying. Let me give you a hypothetical. Assume that I am given a subpoena to appear before the grand jury, and I'm asked to testify about a crime my best friend committed. And I don't want to testify, either because I'm loyal to my best friend, or I'm scared, or I'm just not interested in participating. And so I walk into the grand jury, or I have my lawyers write a letter, like Eric Trump's lawyers did, and I say, I invoke my Fifth Amendment right. I'm not testifying. Well, I haven't committed a crime. So if I were forced to testify pursuant to that subpoena, I would have nothing to offer that would incriminate me. It would incriminate my friend. So you know what we do under those circumstances? We go from and I've done this 100 times. We go from the grand jury, if a witness invokes his right, his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, we walk across the street to the courthouse, and we litigate the issue in front of the chief judge, who has supervisory authority over the grand jury proceedings. And then it would be up to me and my lawyers to prove to the judge's satisfaction that I have a right against self-incrimination, that if I were forced to testify, I'd be incriminating myself. not my friend. And if I couldn't convince the judge of that, he or she would order me to testify about what my friend did. So it really is only people who would incriminate themselves because they committed a crime that can invoke the Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. So what have we learned AG Tish James' next step is? Well, the New York Times just told us in its reporting. Here's what the New York Times headline reads. Quote, New York Attorney General asks judge to order Eric Trump's testimony. And then it continues. The Trump Organization has stalled a state inquiry into the financing of 4 properties for months, AG Leticia James said in court papers, close quote. So that is Attorney General James doing exactly what we discussed a few minutes ago. She is going to require Eric Trump and his lawyers to appear before a judge and make their case that Eric really does have a privilege against self-incrimination because Eric really did commit crimes as part of the Trump Organization. I suspect Eric and his lawyers will be able to convince a judge that he has a Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination, and therefore he will not be required to testify pursuant to that subpoena. The only way to get around that is if Tish James decided to grant Eric Trump immunity. Because if you grant somebody immunity, that extinguishes, it does away with their Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, because that immunized testimony can't be used against them, so they can't incriminate themselves. But I predict Tish James won't grant him immunity because she and others may have an interest in prosecuting Eric Trump in the future. And once you grant somebody immunity, it becomes very difficult to prosecute them. So stay tuned, because I think there are many steps that will unfold in the coming days, and we'll learn more about whether Eric Trump will or will not be required by the judge to testify. I predict he will not, because I'm betting he has a legitimate Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Let's turn to the second issue just briefly, and that is, has Eric Trump now joined the proud Fifth Amendment club together with his dad and his brother Don Jr.? I suggest he has, and here's why. The Mueller report, let's go back to that for a minute, gives us a roadmap to whether Donald Trump, the president, and Donald Jr., his son, invoked their rights against self-incrimination during the Mueller investigation. And here is what gives us a glimpse inside that issue. It's a passage from the Mueller report dealing with Mueller's attempt to interview Donald Trump voluntarily before deciding whether or not to serve him with a subpoena. And here's how that passage in the Mueller report reads. Quote, "We also sought a voluntary interview with the president. After more than a year of discussion, the president declined to be interviewed. And immediately after that, there's a black bar, a redaction of one sentence, and it says it was redacted for grand jury secrecy purposes." I can all but guarantee you, folks, under that redaction, it says that Donald Trump's lawyers told Bob Mueller that if subpoenaed, Donald Trump would invoke his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The fact that it only makes sense that that would be the next sentence, right? And we know Bob Mueller never did subpoena the president because his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination would have trumped, I know, pun intended, would have trumped that grand jury subpoena anyway. And the fact that it's redacted, it's blacked out for grand jury secrecy purposes, makes perfect sense, because even discussing the topic of a grand jury subpoena and whether somebody will invoke their right against self-incrimination to try to defeat that grand jury subpoena, to try to keep from having to testify, even that information, that discussion is protected under the grand jury secrecy rules, which is why Bob Mueller blacked out for grand jury secrecy reasons that one sentence. And nearly an identical sentence and redaction appears in the Mueller report regarding Mueller's attempt to testify Don Jr. All of this leads to the conclusion that during the Mueller investigation, both Donald Trump and Don Jr. invoked their Fifth Amendment rights against self-incrimination, as has now Eric Trump. What a proud, proud Fifth Amendment club those three men belong to. They can't testify because they would incriminate themselves. Folks, as always, please stay safe. Stay tuned to this story because there is more to come, probably in the next 24 hours, on the Eric Trump invocation of his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. And I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow.